Welcome to the first in our spring programme of exploring research seminars. Is tear gas as British as tea? And thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Owen O'Carney. I'm a research development specialist at Wellcome Collection, and my pronouns are he and him. To make events like this one more accessible, we ask speakers to introduce themselves with a brief visual description. So, I'm a white man with dark hair dressed in a somewhat conventional shade of blue. And I'm joining you this evening from my bedroom, where I'm sat in front of the by now familiar backdrop, a set of bookshelves. Before introducing tonight's speaker, I want to cover some housekeeping guidelines. These seminars showcase research that draws on material from our collections to explore how we all think and feel about health. The spring programme covers the modern and contemporary periods. For other seminars in the series, please visit our website. Find a link in the chat. This event will run for an hour. Dr Anna Feigenbaum will share a presentation with us for about 40 minutes, and then there will be a chance to ask questions using the Q&A channel. If you have any other queries for the event organisers, you can post these in the general chat, and we'll try to help resolve them. If Anna doesn't have time to answer all your questions, we will send them to her, and hopefully she'll have a chance to pick them up afterwards. Please note that we are recording this event, and a link will be sent out via Eventbrite afterwards. All names from the chat will be anonymised in the recording. Closed captions are available. Switch these on, click on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. The accessibility of these events is a priority for us. Please let us know if you have any suggestions for how to improve on this. A brief feedback questionnaire will be available in the chat at the end of the event. Please use this to let us know how we might improve the programme. Having said all that, it is now my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Please welcome Dr. Anna Feigenbaum. Anna is an Associate Professor in Communication and Digital Media at Bournemouth University. She's also the author of Tear Gas, From the Battlefields of World War I to the Streets of Today. Anna, please start when you're ready.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to set up my slides. All right, great. And just because I can't see you, just shout in if anything malfunctions or stops working. Thank you all for joining me. Thank you, Owen, for this introduction and the invitation to present. As some of you have already commented on Twitter, this title is, of course, a little bit of a play. So before I get into that, as I've been asked to do, I am Dr. Anna Feigenbaum. I have black curly hair. I am wearing a block color burgundy, and I likewise have the now familiar virtual background that got given a nice little facelift by the Wellcome Trust photographers in preparation for this event, which was so nice that I decided to keep it. So that's what we're seeing behind me. I hope that some of you do have a cup of tea as we go through this history of tear gas that I will be doing in a sort of a three-act formulation. We're going to start in the Bogside of Northern Ireland. We're then going to go back in time to World War I, to the trenches, coming back up to the Bogside, and then we're going to go from then into the present day. I'm going to start with just a short little primer on what tear gas is for anyone who's joining that hasn't really thought about tear gas before. And as you'll come to see during the course of the talk, the title has to do with the way that British culture can shape and influence an item, a technology, a cultural object, without it necessarily being the point of origin, or without it necessarily being something that is per se British. But like tea, tear gas would not be what it is today without the British influence and without the British colonial experience, which we're just going to kind of touch on in this talk today. And of course, this is a massive topic, and there's lots and lots of different angles that I'm going to bring in, some of which are quite heavy. So if you have questions or you want me to explain anything more that I brush over quickly, please just pop them into the chat in the Q&A, and I'm happy to talk about any of the aspects of the presentation with you then. All right, so let's get started. What I'm going to talk to you today is from my book, Tear Gas and Battlefields of World War I to the Streets of Today, which you can get through Verso. And again, if there's anything you want to know more about, it is probably answered in the book. The other thing just to say on that is that I'm going to be showing you documents from various archives, including Wellcome Trust, that I went to. And so I've noted, but in quite fine print, so if anyone needs more information, just let me know. At the bottom right-hand corner, what archive those documents come and where I did the research for the particular section of the talk that I am on about. So to begin with, just a little primer on tear gas for anyone who is new to thinking about this. And this is an infographic that I'm showing that comes from the Riot ID project, which is a collaboration between myself and an NGO and a creative design studio. And so tear gas is a kind of colloquial term that we use for lacrimatory agents, which refers to a class of substances that are made up of different kinds of chemicals. The most common are the ones that we abbreviate as CS and CN. Well, we think, of course, of tear gas as being something that affects the eyes, that causes tears, where it gets its name. It, in fact, is a lot more than that. And importantly, in the contemporary context, it's a respiratory, it works on a respiratory system, and that's why there's been a few more headlines than normal about tear gas and its harms in recent months. So it causes all kinds of panic, vomit, sore throat, bad digestion, burning in the eyes. It can cause burns on the skin. It can cause shortness of breath. And when someone gets hit with a canister is where we get a lot of times serious injuries, or when someone has a pre-existing respiratory condition that gets made worse or worsened. And we know things like it's quite dangerous for asthmatics and epileptics, as well as for the very young and very old. And the severity of how much tear gas is harmful or lethal has to do with the amount that's fired in the space and how confined the space is that it is fired in. So it's measured in a similar way to air pollution. So if you're in a place with polluted air where it's very stagnant and it's very enclosed, that's going to be a lot more intense than if you're in a big open space where there's not much pollution in the air. And we're going to come back around to that as well. So we have a number of these infographics up on the Riot ID website if anyone is keen to learn more on the basics of this. So I was quite grateful for this invitation from the Wellcome Trust because this project began in the Himsworth collection of the Wellcome Trust Library. I had just pitched the idea of doing a history of tear gas book to a number of publishers, and I was writing my sample chapter, and I was on a trip back to the UK from a postdoc in the US where I had just gone to visit Derry for the first time and to interview some of the people who had been involved in the Free Derry campaign, which we'll come to in a moment. And I then traveled down from Northern Ireland to London to visit the Himsworth collection at the Wellcome Trust Library, which was together a quite contrasting and wonderful experience as a researcher for anyone else in the audience who does interviews and archival work. They always blend quite neatly together. So without further ado, we will begin in the Bogside, and I'm going to read some short excerpts of the book in between showing you some images and talking through some of the elements of this history. So, Derry, or Londonderry, depending on which side of the Troubles your sympathies lie, is located just beside the border that cuts the Republic of Ireland from Northern Ireland. As residents will tell you, the split name says it all. While road signs inside the Republic will point you towards Derry, those in Northern Ireland direct you to Londonderry. Both are constantly defaced, leaving visible layers of the city's contentious past. The city's colonial architecture and unique landscape have shaped the political struggles of its inhabitants for more than 4 centuries. Between 1614 and 1619, King James I erected city walls of thick lime, earth, and local stone to protect and partition Protestant settlers from Irish Catholic rebels, financed by the London businessmen of the Irish Society. Outside the city walls was the area now known as the Bogside. Originally underwater, this area gained its name when water levels fell and the river became a stream, eventually allowing structures to be built along the Bogside. The 1700s and 1800s saw impoverished Donegal families move into the area. They are thought to have been in transit, seeking passage out, but limited finances and few job skills left them stuck in the bog in poor conditions. Over time, the population grew younger and the area's infrastructure older. By the mid-1900s, overcrowding was commonplace throughout the Bogside. 3 generations of families could be found crammed into 2 rooms. Quote, allegations of discrimination in housing allocations, a Royal Commission report read, exist on a wide scale, particularly where a dispersal of the population would result in changed political base. So to keep their seats, members of the parliament tried to secure districts by forcing Irish families to remain in the Bogside. A new housing estate, and this will become very important to our story, the Rosville Flats, went up, standing 10 stories high and housing 178 families. The building's red, yellow, and blue decor and flat railed rooftop made it a pillar amid that area's sunken landscape. Yet this mega estate was not enough to solve the housing shortage. Plans for more home construction in other wards encountered challenges from the Unionist Corporation, which continued to block progress to maintain political and economic control of Derry. Inspired by struggles overseas, particularly in the United States, Palestine, and South Africa, Bogside tenants and local socialists began to organize, forming, among other groups, the Derry Housing Action Committee. Quote, there was a high unemployment, no housing program at all, electoral boundaries hadn't been expanded, and there was no such thing as one man, one vote. There were all sorts of things wrong, committee member Dermy McClicken recalls. The organization began by disrupting housing council meetings. A direct action campaign soon followed in the flurry of worldwide uprisings that spread across the spring of 1968. So there's a lot of details that come between that and what came to be the Battle of the Bogside. But basically, you had a growing housing rights campaign, a growing sort of social justice, civil rights campaign that was centered in this area. There was a number of conflicts between both Protestants and the Catholics, as well as between the police and the Catholics. And there was a police brutality incident that led to, as is often the case, that led to some resistance from the local community. And on the day of what was called the Apprentice Boys March, which was the Protestant celebration, the residents of this area called the Bogside decided that they weren't going to let the marchers march through their area. They were going to defend their area from what they saw as this kind of encroachment and further sort of belittling and brutality that they were facing. And so they declared a free Derry, and they erected barricades surrounding their neighborhood in order to keep Protestants out. This led to a variety of clashes during the day with the police and then the military called in. So at 11:45 that night, Rosville Street became the first UK site of civilian CS gassing. On advice from the Ministry of Defence, the Royal Ulster Constable sought out CS supplies. The RUC quickly telephoned the Minister for Home Affairs. While driving from Belfast, the Minister approved the deployment. Supplies of CS were brought in from nearby military storage. According to the RCU, police responsible for discharging CS in the Bogside has received some, but not enough training. Officers were issued with 1.5-inch Veary pistols with a 70 to 80-yard range for defense, as well as canisters to use when drawing. All day on August 13th, they fired CS intermittently in attempts to disperse the crowds. The gas kept coming until 4:30 in the afternoon on August 14th. Derry resident Dr. Raymond McLean found himself baffled by the gas's effects. Not only were their eyes inflamed and watery, but many of the locals who were coming into the clinic weren't able to breathe to such an extent that several were carried in. I didn't know what we were dealing with. People didn't know how to respond to the CS gas. Were they better off opening windows and doors to clear it out, or should they shut them tighter and prevent another round getting in? As its inventors were well aware, CS gas causes as much psychological fear as it does physical pain. And so here is an image of what the streets looked like from the top of the Rosville estate. And here is an image of some of these kind of boys that had been gassed that Dr. McLean is describing in his testimony from this event. So how did this CS gas get approved for use on civilian soil in the UK? Where did it come from? Why was it okay to use? And why were people so surprised or shocked to see it used in a civilian setting? And this is the first, this is where the history, those of the fine-tooth comb might know this, but so the first CS gas, civilian gassing on a protest situation. However, there were drills and tests that were done using CS gas in between this time period. But this was a really big shock when this had happened in the UK. So to understand how the tear gas got there, we have to go back to the trenches in France of the First World War. So trench warfare had caused a bit of a stalemate, and neither side was able to advance. And so they began to experiment with poison gases as a way of getting people to come out of the trenches so that they could either be hit with more intense forms of gas or that they could be hit with artillery fire. And so tear gas was one of these gases that kind of got played around with at this time. The early uses of it weren't actually very effective. And of course, our bigger memories of trench warfare are probably of mustard gas, which is more severe. But it was in this very large spread of development of chemical weapons that tear gas came to be. And when the war ended, so much effort had been put into the kind of getting these chemical weapons off of the ground, as well as some other kinds of new technologies, that after the war ended, a lot of people had a vested interest, including chemical companies, including all of the people invested in these chemical companies, as well as the people who had been working in these chemical warfare services, to create what they called a peacetime market for these wartime goods. And in the United States, where we saw one of the biggest pushes for CS gas to move from the battlefield to the street, actually it wasn't CS at the time, but what became CS gas, came from General Amos Fries, who had been a veteran of World War I, and he became, soon after the end of the war, the head of the U.S. Chemical Warfare Service. And he started basically a giant publicity campaign working with publicists and lawyers and chemical companies in order to start a commercial market for tear gas. And the very first manufacturers of tear gas had started by donated military supplies that had been given to kind of his wartime buddies who went off and started these very first companies. And also at this time, Germany and South Africa and France also had some commercial civilian development, but the US was probably unsurprisingly for many of you, leading the market in this military technology. And I'm just going to pull out some of the important things from this period of history. And one is this investment in chemistry and this investment in this idea of a militarized science and the idea that this was a civilized form of warfare as opposed to the kinds of warfare that came before. And this is particularly relevant in the US, where 10% of all working chemists had been enlisted into the war effort. And so you see these kinds of claims to modernization, such as the one here. I'm showing a flyer from one of these early companies, Lake Erie Chemical Co., that had been started with this donated samples from the military. So science is on the firing line. Are you still using bow and arrows? And really important, this pairing of the kind of civilized versus the uncivilized that's going to keep coming up in this story around tear gas. Another promise that tear gas made, or the first pushers of tear gas made, was that no permanent injury was possible. This was a lie at the time, or at least not founded on evidence, and it continues to be, as we will see later in this talk, just an untruth, a false news that continues to circulate for a variety of reasons. But it was a very, very big part of the initial marketing push. And then there was this psychological element that was also really important for the ways that tear gas was marketed and the ways that it continues to be used today. And so one of the things Amos Fries famously said about tear gas in the early days was that when you disperse a crowd by making noisy leaders and members of the public seasick, tearful, and repentant, you make the whole disorderly movement ridiculous and arouse public laughter and derision. And so there was this idea that you could win the PR battle, you could win the media war by using tear gas, what we sometimes refer to today as turning a protest into a riot. So this is really importantly part of the very original push for this weapon. And this is an image from one of the first large-scale uses of tear gas in the United States in 1932 against something called the Bonus Army encampment. The tear gas had been used a lot already to disrupt mostly union protests. This is the rise of kind of labor unions at the time. This is during the Great Depression in the United States, so there's a lot of sort of upheaval around financial issues. And Bonus Army was kind of part of this movement. These were retired veterans who had been promised these kinds of bonuses for serving in World War I, who marched to Washington, D.C. en masse, so thousands and thousands of people, to claim the checks. And they sent the military with tear gas out against them. And so this became one of the sort of defining moments for sort of what the mass use of tear gas could do. Importantly, they would take photographs from these kinds of events, and these photographs would become the new marketing material for how to create more buyers for tear gas, both nationally and internationally. So these were in sort of more modern work, I refer to these as the kind of fashion weeks for the police. So these massive protests that they know are going to get a lot of media coverage become places to show off new weaponry, and that continues today. So that's what's going on in the US. What's going on with the UK and the British Empire, which is, of course, very large at this time in history still. So at first, the UK was very, very opposed to the idea that you would use war gases for peacetime. Unlike the Americans, who were touting the fact that this was a civilized technology, the British thought that this was actually more barbaric. They thought, they really wanted to condemn the Germans' use of war gases, and as part of that, there was this distancing from what had happened, this sort of idea for the British that war gases were inhumane. And so you had these two different kinds of ideologies playing out at this time. And so over a decade after the United States and other nations first introduced war gases for peacetime use, why did the UK continue to hesitate? The mounting protests in the colonies were forcing debate between the War Office, the Colonial Office, the Army Council, and British embassies. Opinions conflicted both between and within each organization. So they were watching these other countries. So they were watching in the US, tear gas be used domestically to quell these uprisings and protests, and they were watching France use this in their colonies. They were watching South Africans use this, and they were like, some people were like, why aren't we using this tear gas? Let's get in on this. And other people really were of this idea that it was inhumane. And so this debate started to play out between these offices, and this was as a researcher, quite exciting history to try and tease out, because it was extremely nonlinear. And one of the reasons for that, aside from the fact that, right, we don't have the kinds of digital records we do today, and all of this was being passed around on either, typewritten notes or handwritten letters, but also the staff changeovers and the constant kind of elections and rotating seats in all of these councils meant that people were constantly coming in and out of office from different parties with different ideologies, with different military ideas. And so to piece together this part of the history, I was looking at a bunch of memos and letters that got sent between these different departments, and they would they were called these circulars, and they would get more and more things sort of attached to them, but they seemed to be moving not necessarily chronologically forward through time, because sometimes someone would find one and then pull it out 4 years later and then send it because all of a sudden the debate about tear gas arose again. So this is just really quite interesting kind of history to piece together. And I'm going to show you some of the images. The text will probably be too small to read on your screen, but just to give you a sense of the kinds of documents that I'm talking about. So this is an example of a circular. They would be these kinds of lists of different news events where tear gas had been successfully used. And so this one has an example from Sherman, Texas, May 1930, and it also has an extract from South Africa newspaper from 1929. And so these would just be kind of compiled sometimes along with news clippings. And this is another example of one of these circulars. So these are news clippings that some colonial officer had taken and then attached to these circulars to send to yet another office, and so forth and so on. And so we were starting, particularly in India, to see these kinds of debates about whether or not it was actually right to use tear gas. So this is kind of unfolding between the late 1920s into the early 1930s. And getting closer to kind of in the 1930s, but it kind of between 1930 and 1935 is where the kind of decision making to allow tear gas happens. And we start to see the emergence of two key reasons why the British Empire switches its position and justifies this use for actually, we do need some tear gas. Let's get in on this tear gas thing. And the first reason that they give, they call the woman problem. And the language here is taken from the archival documents. So the woman problem was this issue, and again, you might not be able to read the text on your screen, this issue that in India and in Nigeria in particular, they were being faced by protesters that were composed largely of women. And it says here at the end, recently in Nigeria, a hostile mob was composed largely of women, and the local troops showed the greatest dislike in firing on the crowd when that course became inevitable. And so there was this sort of moral dilemma of not wanting to be seen to be firing on live ammunition at women. And so this was causing an issue for maintaining colonial order. And the other problem was the passive resistance problem, largely associated to the Gandhian independence movement. And here they, again, didn't want to look bad by firing on the crowd. And if for anyone who recalls the Armastar Massacre of 1919, the British, when some British officers had fired on an unarmed crowd in an enclosed or walled garden area, and hundreds of people were killed. And this was very bad for the way that the empire looked at the time. And so there was this idea after that massacre that they never really wanted that kind of tragedy or that kind of action to happen again. And so that the massacre would come up in these circulars as an example of why they needed tear gas. So this was a much more benevolent, a much kinder, a much more humane solution than having to fire on unarmed people, and particularly in crowds that included women and children. And so we see this flip from the idea that tear gas is inhumane, that it's barbaric, that it's chemical warfare, to this idea that is actually a benevolent and kind and humane alternative for maintaining order. And in 1935, the UK changes its position and makes the official declaration, not only that the colonies can use tear gas, but they also, and this is important just infrastructurally, that they don't have to ask for permission from the Secretary of State back in the UK. They can make the decisions on their own to use it. And so, of course, we then see a huge upsurge in the desire to order tear gas supplies to in the different countries, and also in the different areas of the different countries, which all have their own sort of colonial administrators. And so there's a huge increase in demand that hits the market in the late 1930s and into the early 1940s. That leads to two important problems. One, not enough stock. So the US and South Africa and a little bit in Europe are the only places that are really developing in any kind of mass tear gas. And so the other option, because they didn't have enough in the UK, was going to be to get supplies from the United States. But for various reasons, that was not really desirable. And it involved going through a lot of, let's say, some shady deals that I tried to find out more about. I really wanted to write about these guys called the Govan brothers, but I couldn't find enough information. But there were these like really kind of sketchy deals going on where the tear gas was like being brought in from commercial companies in the US by like private airline companies and then being like distributed to the police. So it was not a desirable situation for those in power. And so they wanted to have domestic supply. The UK wanted to be producing its own supply. And the other big problem was that the supplies that already existed in the UK, so the military supplies that were already being used, and of course, tear gas hasn't been used in any kind of large scale by militaries at this point. And the last time it was really even used was during the First World War. So it's not like these were up-to-date technologies. And so the supplies, it turned out that the British did have on hand, the number 92 grenades, were very dangerous. They used it to stop a prison riot, a kind of conflict between about 1,000 prisoners in India that were put in prison after a protest. And it ended up killing 2 people and injuring a number others in a sort of covered up incident that happened. But the outcome of that incident was that they needed new, that was not going to be acceptable to be using the ones they already had. So the British needed to take the production of tear gas home. And so it came to Porton Down. So during the period of the kind of, now we're kind of getting into the 1950s, but a little bit in the 1940s, but mostly in the kind of 1950s and forward, we start to have mass testing and development of new gases happening at Porton Down. Tests are being done on animals as well as on humans. The human trials that led to the modern form of CS gas are really brilliantly documented in Rob Evans' book Gassed. And the next few documents I'm going to be talking through come from the archival collection that he donated to the King's College Military Archives. And so here we just have some quotes from people who were part of these tests. Actually, I'll read you the next one for time. So, for example, they put us in the gas chambers. We tested CS gas. Some of the tests are horrendous. I had no idea what they are doing. As far as I was concerned, they were doing common cold research tests. I volunteered to earn a bit of extra leave. In one test, we had to stand in front of a stream of gas, which I could not stand for more than a minute. My face was stinging, my throat was red raw, and my lungs were burning. I was paid 2 shillings. It was a dirty trick, plain and simple. And so these thousands of war veterans and soldiers had been tricked, as came out in the class action lawsuit that they later won over these trials, into testing CS and CR gas. And so you can see again, this is quite small, but overall, thousands of altogether 2,803 veterans were part of these trials, and then a number of veterans for other kinds of gas trials as well. And so these trials on animals and humans are what led to the modern form of CS gas that became what was stocked by the UK. So what became the sort of modern form of tear gas, and a lot of knowledge exchange happening between the US and the UK around what we consider the modern form of tear gas. So that brings us back to the Bogside. So kind of picking up our story where we left off, when the period of 36 hours of tear gassing finished in the Bogside, a total of 14 50-gram grenades, so big handheld grenades, and over 1,000 cartridges. So those are the kind of canister. They look almost like the size of kind of Red Bull cans or soda cans, containing 12.5 grams of CS, had blanketed the Bogside. So this is the largest civilian CS gassing that had happened over a sustained period of time in this boggy, sunken area of Northern Ireland. And so this, of course, caused a wave of attention both nationally and internationally, media uproar, media panic. What was this stuff? Why was it used? Were we going to see more of it? Right. So they kind of went into this kind of chaotic period that led to an inquiry. And this inquiry was what brings us to our Wellcome Trust archive and to the Himsworth committee report. So I'm going to do another little kind of excerpted read here. So facing a PR disaster, the Home Office had to act quickly, setting up yet another tribunal to look into Northern Ireland's most recent disturbances and announcing that a full medical investigation would be conducted into the effects of CS gas in the Bogside. Sir Harold Himsworth, a physician in London, was appointed to lead the medical investigation. Himsworth, an advocate of fusing the skills of politicians and scientists, had served as secretary to the Medical Research Council and presided over the section of experimental medicine at the Royal Society of Medicine. In 1952, he was knighted into the Order of Bath for his contributions to civil service. A 1958 New Scientist article profiling Himsworth's accomplishments called him a man of undoubted authority, receptive, courteous, and decisive. On September 1st, 1969, Himsworth and his team arrived in Belfast. Their first stop was the Ministry of Health, where they were briefed on the events in Derry by a group of Belfast doctors and government officials. They headed to the Army headquarters for an, quote, off-the-record interview with Sir Ian Freeland, Director of Operations in Northern Ireland, and a briefing on the situation from the brigade commander. This was followed by another press conference in which Himsworth insisted that, quote, there was nothing sinister in the use of CS gas. Himsworth was, quote, again, kindly loaned the Army's public relations officer. And by the end of the evening, the team additionally secured help from Colonial Colonel Millman, who proffered any assistance within his power. On day 2, Himsworth Committee ventured into the Bogside. Picking their way over rubble and through the ruins of barricades, they were quickly surrounded by locals anxious to tell their stories. They questioned a girl clutching a teddy bear as her mother explained the persistence of her sore eyes and lips. Derry doctor Donald McDermott related that, quote, scores of people had suffered from vomiting, diarrhea, and nausea. 50-year-old resident reported her pet budgie had died in its cage. Others shared stories of how children appeared to suffer more acutely than adults. Confused and scared, youngsters often rubbed their eyes, worsening the effects. The committee canvassed the area, examining the Roseville flats and CS cartridges saved by the Citizens Association. Himsworth expressed skepticism over media claims that there had been 60 to 100 cases of gastroenteritis and diarrhea. If this were true, he argued, it should have been officially classified as a major crisis. Illness at that scale required government notification. What he didn't see was that, in the middle of a riot, people's fears of arrest and the frenzy of the commotion bar many from seeking local hospital treatment. Even under normal conditions, people in impoverished areas are reluctant to go to hospitals or doctors for digestive problems, preferring to tough it out or use home remedies. But in a city divided along religious, political, and economic lines, seeking formal medical care was even more contentious. This city of two names was also a city of two hospitals. The nearest was staffed by unionist doctors, and many Bogside residents avoided it, opting instead to cross the border into Ireland and receive treatment there. Most medical treatment during the Battle of the Bogside happened in the candy corner shop at the top of Westland Street. Off-duty nurses and medics set up treatment posts inside the store. Dr. Raymond McLean, wife Sheila, drove over the bridges to the hospital for antiseptics, dressings, and suturing supplies. The candy corner was first treated casualties from stone throwing and street fights. After the gassing began, the makeshift medical staff treated lacerations, concussions, and head injuries from CS cartridges, including a young man whose nose was severely severed off his face. They worked without adequate space or equipment. As gas casualties poured in, volunteer nurse recalls, we really were at a loss on what way to treat it because we really weren't taught basic first aid. We only had been taught basic first aid. We'd never been taught how to manage tear gas. The staff spent over 24 sleepless hours tending CS victims. The tear gas crept into the candy store as the police advanced, forcing the medical team to relocate. Supplies in hand, they carried the sick up the hill to Cregan, where they reestablished the first aid center in a local boys' club until the gassing finally ceased. Amid these riotous conditions, it is difficult to imagine how standard hospital notification procedures would be carried out. But Himsworth, a man of record, sought statistics. He was after authorized laboratory reports, not regular people's tales of gassed budgies or gassed babies or dead budgies. Throughout his diary of the visit, and this is the diary is where a lot of the quotes that I'm reading are from, which is held in the Wellcome Trust collection, he records residents' stories of their experiences and effects with suspicion and occasionally derision. And so what really struck me as I was going through this archive was this sense that Himsworth had that the only thing that mattered were clinical records. And so all of this personal testimony, all of this actual talking to people didn't matter. And less surprising, but important, was that this independent committee that he was part of was staffed by members of the military. In fact, at one point, one of his own committee members raised officially in a meeting whether or not that was a conflict of interest, and he was told not to worry about it. And so you have this kind of troubling sense of independence in these inquiry committees mixed with this very particular kind of view of what counts as medical information. And of course, these debates have become ever more pressing in recent. And so I'm just going to take us through a little bit of what's in that Himsworth report, and then we'll move on to the final section of the presentation. So the main thing that Himsworth report did was it collected all of this different, I mean, not exactly a systematic lit review, but it kind of looked across lots and lots of studies that had been done and existed, and it tried to kind of extrapolate from them some basic things that we could say about CS and its safety and its dangers. And so one of the main things that he did was create the scale for how much is kind of too much CS gas. And so the report is full of all these kinds of, for any diagram people in the audience, is full of all of these kinds of calculations that come from various studies on animals and humans that they've kind of put together into what continues to be the only real record of any of this kind of data that's synthesized in this way. And so in practical terms, what that basically means is that they gave us this ability to understand the impacts and effects of tear gas if it was, say, went into one of these rooms in the Roswell Flats versus if it was, fired into an alleyway or a street corner. So these different places where CS is released. So when the report came out, it declared that CS gas was safe, that no healthy person had been harmed, and it was given full clearance to be used in the future in riots. And this sent an uproar through the local community. Dr. Raymond McLean, who'd been the one at Candy Corner, who was running the medical outpost there, whose wife was driving across the border to get the hospital supplies, was absolutely infuriated. Had worked quite closely with Himsworth when Himsworth had been in the Bogside, and he really was not expecting the report to just absolutely, completely ignore all of these testimonies that had come from local residents. And so in an open letter, in a letter from McLean to Himsworth, and also he also published openly in the British Medical Journal of his upsetness about what had happened. One of the things that he says is, when one considers the serious escalation in the use of concentration of CS gas used in Derry in August 1969, and also during recent weeks by British soldiers on the entire population of Cregan, the real purpose of this report must remain in serious question. And of course, here he is referring to the legitimization of the use of CS gas in a kind of colonial situation in which it is being given this green light. And so we have these echoes from that 1935 decision and that change of heart or shift of perspective coming up again here in the Battle of the Bogside. And McLean was not alone in being quite upset about the findings of this report. Some members from a group called British Society for Social Responsibility and Science, or BSRS, whose collection is going to be opened at Wellcome Chapter, I'm very excited for that, had also gone to visit Londonderry with a small group of scientists, sociologists, researchers, and had done their own investigation into and interviewing people into the experiences that people had. And their results looked like what Dr. McLean had found, but did not look anything like what ended up coming out in Himsworth's report. So to conclude, I just want to run us through some of the legacies of the Himsworth Committee report and just a few kind of initial reflections on what I think the importance and the impact of the report and this whole context in which it was written has for today. And so first, just a few examples of where this report has been cited. Moving into the present. So it was importantly part of the debates around the use of tear gas in the occupied territories during the first Intifada, in which over 100 people are thought to have died from tear gas-related injuries. And the kind of argument against keeping exports banned was that the Himsworth report had said that CS was safe, and so it should be fine for the U.S. to be shipping it over to Israel. In the next slide, this is the Waco Siege in 1993, another U.S. reference. And here, this is a very American story. There was a kind of a cult, a sect that was living in a compound in Texas, and they got into a standoff with law enforcement that eventually led to tear gassing in order to try and clear people out of the compound. with contributions. It's still unclear exactly how the fire started, but they used an incendiary form, so a form of CS gas that catches fire, and a giant fire happened that led to the death of 76 of the people inside this compound, including 25 children. And during the investigation into this incident, and that is Congressman Sonny Bono asking this question for anyone who can read the slide. That is, in fact, Cher's husband, Bono, because we're American. So the decision to approve the gassing of the Davidians with CS was based on Dr. Salem's advice on the report prepared by the British research team. He asks Attorney General Janet Reno, and she says, I believe it is called the Himsworth Report. So again, the Himsworth Report sort of it's taking up this place as the justificatory document for why CS gas is thought to be safe. And this language from the Himsworth Report that dominates the military and policing use in civilian contexts of large amounts of CS gas is also taken up in the humanitarian language around it, where because we have seen tear gas be classified as a drug and not as a weapon, because it's been said to be safe, that then when it is used in ways that are harmful, humanitarian organizations take on this language as if it's not a weapon to begin with. So we see all this rhetoric around weaponizing tear gas, unlawful uses of tear gas. And so there's this idea that this was a chemical weapon made for trench warfare is now only a weapon if it's used in certain kinds of ways. And so we see this even in this kind of humanitarian discourse. And we also, of course, see it in our military and our kind of military media and kind of politicians' discourse, and where Trump quite famously would assure people that tear gas was very, very safe, and we would often see kind of news commentators just sort of dismissing tear gas as, oh, it just makes you cry, it's no big deal. And so this kind of legacy of the Himsworth Report and this declaration of safety sort of gave this kind of scientific credence, or what I call in the book a sort of seal of approval or a safety stamp, to that earlier logic that we saw in the 1920s and 1930s, where military men were trying to create this commercial market by promising the safety of tear gas. And so it sort of gave that this sort of knowledge stamp. And so that's kind of always been my sort of take on Himsworth. But in putting together this presentation, I was also thinking about the legacies of BizRiz and the importance of citizen science to how we understand this. So just going to end with a couple more slides to kind of show you what I like to think of as, from my perspective, the more positive legacies of this conflict or this contestation. So this is an image from the tally. It's like a spreadsheet kind of thing of the tally that the British Society for Social Responsibility in Science did when they went to Himsworth and interviewed people and recorded what had happened to them, what kinds of weapons were used, how did they experience the injury, how much. And it struck me in putting together this presentation for the first time how much this document looked like other things that I've been studying in the contemporary around the ways that police brutality is currently monitored. And so I'm just going to show you a few images of that. So this is Ferguson in 2015. This is using a Google Doc. I was helping with some verifications and doing the same kind of thing, though often using both personal testimony as well as social media testimony, and then verifying that by getting in touch with people. This is an even more recent example, again with a Google spreadsheet and quite fancier visualization attached to this. This is done by Forensic Architecture and Billingcat around the Black Lives Matter protest and police brutality in the US over just this past summer. And so to conclude, this is another forensic architecture project that was doing the same kind of thing. So they were gathering social media records and testimony of the mass use of tear gas that had happened in Chile, and in particular in this one plaza in Chile over a 3.5-hour period in which it was just sort of bombarded with tear gas. And they managed to find all these different videos that would capture the amount of tear gas that was used. So they got in touch with me when they were at the sort of this mapping stage of the project to say, did I know anyone who had talked about the concentration and dispersal of tear gas in space? And we looked through loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of documents, and it turned out that the Himsworth report remained the thing that everyone was citing back to. And it is actually the best still sort of record of anything like this that we have. And so we ended up using the Himsworth Committee report to do an activist mapping of the citizen science kind of mapping of the toxicity levels of the projected use of tear gas in the square. And so I'm currently thinking about how we might use the kinds of risk assessment models that we have for things like air pollution to talk about what it would mean to have to use Himsworth's report, but in a way that was about protecting public safety by looking at this kind of ways that we measure toxicity of the air. And this is an incredibly complex, and this is just a sort of prototype of a thought rather than an active project. But I'd like to sort of think about, can we reassess or resurrect the Himsworth report in a way that might look a little bit more like a civic forensics or a kind of citizen science. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing so I can get back onto the platform. I look forward to your questions.
So I'd like to begin by just saying thank you so much, Anna. Your use of the collection came to my own attention last year when we were all confronted by scenes of gas against Black Lives Matter protesters in America, and I'm really excited to have been able to bring you here today to share research which remains unfortunately very relevant today. I want to first turn to the links you draw out with BizRiz. And I appreciate that you haven't been able to access the BizRiz archive, but I know that both in your book and in your talk you've referred to BizRiz, and I guess the two collections can sort of be seen as being in a bit of a critical dialogue with one another. Mm. And I wondered whether or not you'd first come across BizRiz via Himsworth, and I don't know what other wider thoughts you might have on the two collections and how they talk to each other, maybe particularly in relation to the place of science in wider social context.
Yes, I'm pretty sure that would have been where I first crossed BizRiz, because I imagine that there was that correspondence between BizRiz and Himsworth that's in the Himsworth collection. And then I started to see, as I got deeper into the research, I would start to see BizRiz emerging in the other kinds of kind of critical policing technology literature that was circulating and like later in the 70s, and as we got into rubber bullets and things as well. And yeah, and I have to say that it was only when we started talking about Wellcome getting the BizRiz collection that I started thinking and came across Alice Bell's book, which I've not read yet, which is about kind of citizen science and BizRiz, where I started to like, oh wait, this actually is not that different than the kinds of amateur data collection that I'm interested in. I just hadn't put the two things together. And so now I'm quite fascinated to go back and look at what BizRiz was up to through the kind of lens of what I think about as kind of citizen-generated data now. And I think, for me at least, and if anyone from BizRiz happens to be in the audience, I would love to hear from you. But my hypothesis, I suppose, is that when we think of BizRiz as doing mostly science, we miss out on some of the really important kind of methods that they were using for kind of data collection and for counter knowledge production. And I think for me, my interest is really in counter knowledge production, and particularly when the techniques of counter knowledge production are actually using the master's tools. So when we're actually recording things in ways that might be, okay, I'm not going to do your hospital record, but I'm going to ask all the same questions that they would in a hospital on this separate form. So that if we go to trial or we go to something, I'm going to be able to give you evidence that you were not able to get. And that's where I think a lot of power lies. That's where I'm really interested in those kinds of sophisticated, like what forensic architecture does, those kinds of sophisticated uses of counter knowledge.
Right. We have another question. Someone wondering, is mustard gas actually more severe, as you said? What do you think of Mancu's reference to CS gas being more dangerous than mustard? I don't know if you,
I didn't know that Alex says that. Is that question coming from Alex? If Alex is in the audience, I'd like to know what he thinks. But That's interesting. I never really studied mustard gas in any kind of detail. I just have assumed that because everybody says that it's worse, that it is. So I would be really curious to know what Alex's argument is there. I mean, I definitely think in the contemporary context, like CS gas is a lot more dangerous because it's used so widely. And we have to think about danger in the scale of use and not just the severity of the individual technology. And this, what I will say is that that tension between, so Syrians say today and CS gas is that one of the things that happens is that the kind of group involved in the policy world of chemical weapons tends to sideline the riot control agents, CS and CN and pepper sprays, because they're focused on the real chemical weapons, the ones that can really hurt you. And what that does is it almost creates this, like, contributes to this sort of like, oh, don't worry about those other ones, where those other ones, the CS gases, are the ones that are being used in mass and so actually are causing a kind of daily damage.
Thank you. We've got another question. Did British departments talk about French gas brigades from 1913 or French use of tear gas in mobilizations? First use was May 1st, 1920. Justify and push for domestic use of tear gas in the 20s, 30s.
Is that in the French context? I think I'm following. I mean, the French police, I left this out of this talk, but I often usually say this, but the French police were experimenting with tear gases prior to the First World War and were the first ones to use it in war. And that's thought to be because of the kind of barricades that were common in French protests. And so the French police were already kind of thinking about that. So if I'm understanding the question right, it would make sense that the French police were using it soon after for policing. And of course, the French have been leaders in riot control technology since then.
Right. At the macro historical level, do you feel that there are other comparable cases of a military technology moving from military space into public or civilian space in a way that helps contextualize the positioning of the tear gas debate in the public mind? Was tear gas compared to existent moral debate?
That's a great question. That is also a question I've never been asked before, which is a hard feat after 3 years of book touring. That's a really good question. I mean, I'd be curious if someone else has an example of one. I mean, one thing I found really fascinating when I was reading around, I only really read about military transfers from that period and then more contemporary ones. But things like pesticide came from the war chemical effort, and then all the kinds of things that then got used in gas chambers for prisons as well as and during the Holocaust came from that period of experimentation. And so you had a lot of technology transfer happening around the chemical industries. And I kind of always wanted to do this side project where I looked at because that's also the rise of Dow and the kind of big chemical companies. And I've kind of been wanting to dig into more of the kind of political economy around what was going on with those tech transfers. But yeah, no, I can't think of one that's previous, which would be really interesting. Like, so if someone knows some big medieval technology that would help contextualize, that would be fascinating to look at.
So we're strictly on time now, but are you happy to carry on with a few more questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it.
Yeah, great. What an insightful and impactful presentation. Thank you. I wonder if there's been any contemporary response from the government to these findings and what the archives say about Britain. And have you noticed evidence of destruction of any archives?
So the first half of the question, I mean, I would say because the UK is not really a big user of tear gas, that this stuff is a little less. Like occasionally we saw some British tear gas show up in Hong Kong in the recent protests, but by and large, the UK's involvement was really at these kinds of time periods that I was talking about. In the US context, which I know the most about, and where I do the most kind of consultancy work, there's been a huge upsurge in the last few years of investigations into the harms that tear gas caused. Lots of these kinds of citizen-generated initiatives that are tallying. And often, and not just in the U.S. context, so a lot of times in Turkey, after the Arab Spring, lots of places brought their states to court or their police departments to court and won because of the systematic kind of abuse or misuse of these weapons. So it's not that we don't have kind of counter evidence that actually they're harmful. I don't want to go on and on. There's like lots of reasons why it's very difficult to make legal cases, but nothing has happened yet that's been able to shift policy beyond sort of local injunctions of asking for misuse. But there is legislation, I know in the US context in the works, and I know in other places there have been attempts to try and legislate this. So I think we might see a change in the next kind of decade or so. And destroyed archives, there were definitely things from that period, you know, and I'm not at all an expert on what happened to the colonial archives in England, but of course we know that some were destroyed. And there were definitely holes in the archives, especially around things like the prison case where the people died from those early tear gas grenades in India.
And what about cyanide discussions during the Waco incident aftermath? It was clearly a new element that was not discussed in Himsworth report, first studies being from the 1970s. Didn't it harm the scientific seal of approval?
Oh, I've not looked into cyanide, and Waco is so messy. That's why I just found it very. I just found that exchange in the court report very, very telling that Himsworth gets brought up. But and I'm not sure if you're referring to cyanide as separate from or when other chemicals are also mixed into riot control, which is a big issue. So a lot of times we don't necessarily exactly know what's in tear gas, and that's in part because a company, like a law enforcement agency, could order like a vat of the chemical and then do their own mixing. And so there's all kinds of things that can happen in that mixing and that ratio process. And so people who are working in the policy world are asking for that to be regulated. Whether it's nefarious or accidental, that's one of the things that's thought to cause problems. And there's also often a lot of times where people report symptoms that shouldn't be happening from the normal kinds of ingredients that are in riot control weapons, but they are happening. And it's very difficult without being able to like go in there and because you have to be able to get the chemical to study the chemical. And it because it's designed to be ephemeral, it's incredibly difficult to actually capture and analyze a lot of the stuff that's being used, which is of course not accidental, but part of the design.
Just perhaps a couple more questions. Thank you for an interesting paper. Can you say whether the humanitarian critique of the civilian use of tear gas extended to its military use, or was this confined to more lethal gases such as sarin, etc.? And it ends with, I'm interested in the British chemists involved in obtaining evidence about sarin circa 1943-45.
So for the first part, okay, so the first part of the question is, can you summarize the first bit?
Yeah. So it's about whether there was a humanitarian critique of
the military
in a military context.
Yeah, I mean, those are just two examples. I mean, whenever there's any kind of sort of human rights abuses, there'll often be reports that are generated by these big human rights NGOs. Those are just a couple examples of many of ones that are about tear gas. But of course, they can be about all kinds of other forms of brutality, and they can be in military or policing contexts. So I don't think that you'd have to be doing a study of what are humanitarian report responses to conflict to kind of have a sense of that. For the second part of the question, what I would say is that the Harvard Sussex archive, which I probably should have mentioned in one of the slides, which is a fantastic little archive, though I don't know its current status of accessibility, but it was at Sussex University. And it's a whole collection of all kinds of stuff on chemical and biological warfare that would have lots of the kinds of documents you're talking about. And also that archive I used at King's in the military archives from Rob Evans' book Gassed has lots of stuff on all different kinds of gases beyond tear gas as well.
And then one last question. What about assessing toxicity directly through what military urine analysis like 2-fluorohippuric acid, or what activists me included, did, measuring blood cyanide concentrations. If you've got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean the people that I've talked to who have tried to do this with tear gas, kind of going back to my answer to the previous question, have found that it's just incredibly hard to get like samples of at the time. And so you're either getting like trace elements, and I am not a toxicologist, so like you know more than me. But trying to get the trace elements off the objects, I don't know about doing it through blood testing, or I would think there's probably other kinds of bodily tests that you could do. We've talked about, and if this is someone who's particularly interested in this, please get in touch with me by email. We have talked about and we have scoped a sort of citizen science type study that would be able to do that at medical outposts. But because people don't go to hospitals for the most part, unless they're really, really injured in a protest situation, it's those kind of medical outposts or medic tents that these kinds of things would have to be done at if you wanted sort of immediate on the ground, close to the time of injury data. And that requires, right, a very complex ethical process. So there are some people that we've been kind of scoping a possibility for that kind of study. So we're always looking for toxicologists that are interested in this.
Great. Well, look, we've overrun a little bit. I think there's just time for me to thank you once again, Anna, for a fascinating talk. And thank everyone else for joining us. I look forward to seeing you all at the next Exploring Research seminar on 23rd of March, when Isabel Vela Gregory will be discussing her research on Henry Wellcome's archaeology in the Sudan.